Texas, 1944. The autumn sun hung low over Camp Swift, casting long shadows across the dusty compound where hundreds of German prisoners moved through their daily routines like ghosts in khaki uniforms. Inside the camp's small post office, a makeshift wooden structure that smelled of ink and paper, a young man stood frozen at the counter, his calloused hands gripping a crumpled envelope so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Klaus Bergmann was 23 years old, though his eyes carried the weight of someone much older. A former mechanic from Stuttgart, he'd been captured 8 months earlier in the scorching deserts of North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had finally collapsed under the relentless pressure of Allied forces. The journey from that dusty battlefield to the heart of Texas had been long and strange, filled with ships that rocked endlessly across the Atlantic and trains that rattled through landscapes so vast they seemed impossible to his European eyes. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the envelope in his hands and the 2 words the postal clerk had just spoken: return to sender. The clerk, a middle-aged corporal with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, pushed the envelope back across the scarred wooden counter with a practiced motion that suggested he had done this too many times before. His face showed neither cruelty nor compassion, only the tired indifference of a man following regulations he did not write and could not change. Klaus stared at the envelope as though it had betrayed him. His mother's address was written there in careful, precise handwriting that he had labored over for hours, forming each letter with the kind of attention a drowning man might give to a rope. Frau Helene Bergmann, Schillerstrasse 17, Stuttgart. The address of the small apartment where he had grown up, where his mother had raised him alone after his father died in the First War, where she had kissed his forehead and told him to be careful when he left to join the Wehrmacht. This was the 3rd time. 3 letters, 3 months, 3 rejections. Each time the reason was the same, stamped in red ink across the envelope like a wound that would not heal. Restricted zone. Undeliverable. Return to sender. Klaus felt something break inside his chest. It was not a dramatic breaking, not the kind that comes with thunder or tears. It was quiet and final, like the last timber giving way in a house that has burned too long. His hands began to tremble, and the envelope slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a white bird shot from the sky. He did not bend to pick it up. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, his mind somewhere far away in Stuttgart, where his mother might be standing at a window, watching the street, waiting for a son who would never write, who she believed was already dead. The notification had been sent months ago. Missing in action. Presumed dead. The words that every mother feared, delivered by uniformed men who did not stay long enough to see the grief they left behind. Klaus knew this because other prisoners had told him. The German government was efficient in such matters. They notified families quickly, did not waste time with hope when none existed. His mother had probably already held a memorial service, probably already cleared away his things, probably already learned to live with the hollow ache of a child lost to war. And here he stood, alive, healthy, well-fed even, in a prisoner of war camp in Texas where the guard said good morning and the meals included meat and bread and coffee. He was alive, and his mother was dying, and he could not tell her. She was sick. He had known this before he left for Africa, the cough that would not stop, the weight falling away from her frame like snow sliding from a roof. The doctors had said her lungs were weak, that she needed rest and good food and warmth, 3 things that wartime Germany could not provide. She had waved away his concerns, told him to focus on staying alive, on coming home safely. She had promised to be strong, to be waiting for him. But that was before he became a prisoner. Before the notification. Before she spent 8 months believing her only son was buried in the African sand. Klaus bent slowly and picked up the envelope. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold it. For a long moment, he just stared at those red letters, stamped across his carefully written address, restricted zone, as though love could be restricted, as though a mother's right to know her son lived could be denied by geography and bureaucracy and the cold machinery of war. Then, with deliberate precision, Klaus tore the envelope in half, then in half again, and again. He tore it until it was nothing but confetti in his palms, small white pieces that drifted to the floor like snow, like ash, like all the words he would never be able to send home. The postal clerk watched this with the same tired expression, neither stopping him nor offering comfort. He had seen this before. He would see it again. There were rules, and rules could not bend for individual heartbreak, no matter how genuine. Klaus turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps heavy. He did not notice the woman standing near the door, watching him with eyes that had seen too much grief already. He did not see her face change, something shifting behind her expression, a decision forming in the space between one breath and the next. But Margaret Hayes saw him, and in that moment, watching a young enemy soldier fall apart over a letter that would never reach his mother, she saw her own son. Margaret was 38 years old, with hair that had started going gray at the temples and hands that bore the calluses of ranch work. She was not a soft woman, not in the way some might imagine. Life on a Texas ranch did not allow for softness. Her husband, Thomas, was away most of the time now, working on war production contracts that took him to factories in Houston and Dallas. Their ranch, once a thriving cattle operation, was now run by a skeleton crew of old men, young boys, and increasingly German prisoners of war who were brought in to fill the labor shortage. Margaret had 2 sons. Robert, the oldest, was somewhere in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese in jungles she could not imagine. His letters came sporadically, censored and brief, telling her nothing about where he was or what he faced. David, the youngest, was only 16, too young for the draft, but already talking about lying about his age to enlist. And then there was her brother, James, who would never come home from a beach in Normandy, whose body lay in a grave marked with a white cross somewhere in France. She knew grief. She knew what it meant to wait for letters. She knew the particular terror of a mother whose child is in danger and beyond her reach. That was why she had started volunteering at Camp Swift, not out of any particular sympathy for the Germans, but because she needed something to do, some way to feel useful while her son was at war. The camp administrators were grateful for volunteers. Most locals wanted nothing to do with the prisoners, saw them as the enemy and nothing more. But the camp needed teachers for the English classes the Army provided, needed people to distribute books from the library donations, needed bodies to make the system work. Margaret had been doing this for 3 months now. She came twice a week, teaching basic English phrases to young men who struggled with the strange rhythms of her language. She distributed books from the camp library, watched prisoners check out volumes on everything from agricultural science to American history. She served coffee at the recreation hall and supervised the letter-writing sessions where prisoners were allowed to send carefully censored mail home. She had kept her distance emotionally. These were the enemy. These were the men whose army had started this war, whose submarines had killed American sailors, whose bombs had fallen on London. Her brother had died fighting men just like these. But watching Klaus Bergmann tear his letter into pieces, watching him walk away with his shoulders bent under a weight no 23-year-old should carry, something shifted inside Margaret Hayes. She followed him outside, into the dusty compound where prisoners milled about during their free time. Some played cards. Others stood in small groups, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Klaus had walked to the far edge of the yard, near the fence line, where he stood alone, staring out at the empty Texas landscape beyond the wire. Margaret approached slowly, giving him time to notice her, to compose himself if he needed to. When she was a few feet away, she stopped and spoke in English, knowing he would understand at least some of it. "Excuse me. You are Klaus." "Yes? From the English class?" He turned, surprised, quickly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yes, ma'am. I am Klaus." His English was heavily accented but clear enough. The classes were helping. Margaret hesitated, searching for words. "I saw what happened at the post office. Your letter." Klaus's face hardened, a wall going up behind his eyes. "It is not your concern, ma'am. It is only the war, only the rules." But Margaret shook her head. "I saw your face. That was not just rules. That was personal." For a long moment, Klaus said nothing. Then, perhaps because he had no one else to tell, perhaps because grief needs an audience or it consumes from within, he began to speak. Slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out in a mixture of English and German that Margaret struggled to follow but understood in all the ways that mattered. He told her about his mother, about the apartment in Stuttgart where they had lived their whole lives, about how she had worked in a textile factory after his father died, her fingers bleeding from the looms, her back bent from years of standing, about how she had saved every pfennig to make sure he could finish school, could learn a trade, could have a better life than she had known. He told her about the cough, the sickness that had started before he left for Africa, about how the doctors said her lungs were damaged from years of breathing factory dust and smoke, about how she needed rest and medicine and food, things that were already scarce in Germany even then, before the bombing campaigns had truly begun. He told her about the notification, missing in action, how the Wehrmacht would have sent it within weeks of his capture, efficient as always, how his mother would have received it from a uniformed officer who offered condolences and left, leaving her alone with the news that her only child was gone. "And now," he said, his voice breaking, "now she thinks I am dead. For 8 months she thinks I am dead. Maybe she is dead too. Maybe the bombs, maybe the sickness. And I cannot tell her. I write and write and write, and they send it back, and she will never know I am alive." Margaret felt something crack in her chest, a fissure opening in the wall she had built around her heart. She looked at this young man, this enemy soldier, and saw only a son desperate to reach his mother. She saw Robert, somewhere in the Pacific. She saw David, 16 and reckless. She saw every mother who had ever waited for news that never came. The rules made sense. She understood that. The letters were censored for security, to prevent prisoners from sending coded messages or intelligence back to Germany. Addresses in restricted zones, in industrial areas or military districts were automatically rejected. The system was designed to protect American soldiers, to protect the war effort, to prevent any possible breach that could cost Allied lives. But standing there in the dusty yard of Camp Swift, watching Klaus Bergman fight tears, Margaret Hayes thought about her brother James, buried in France. She thought about how his last letter had taken 6 weeks to reach them, how he had already been dead for a month by the time they opened it. She thought about the agony of not knowing, of waiting, of hoping against hope. If James had been captured, if he had been held in some German camp, if he had been alive when they thought him dead, Margaret would have given anything for someone to help him send word home. She would have begged the heavens for some small mercy, some crack in the bureaucracy, some human being willing to bend the rules for the sake of a mother's heart. And now, here she stood, with the power to be that mercy for someone else's son. The thought terrified her. What she was considering was illegal, certainly against camp regulations, possibly treasonous depending on how the authorities chose to interpret it. If she were caught, there would be consequences. Arrest, perhaps. Prison, maybe. At the very least, scandal and shame, her name dragged through the local papers, her family humiliated. And for what? For a German soldier, for the enemy, for a man whose army had killed her brother. But he was also someone's son, someone's whole world. And his mother was waiting, believing him dead, perhaps dying herself without ever knowing the truth. Margaret looked at Klaus, at his young face aged by war and grief, at his hands that trembled just like Robert's hands had trembled the day he left for training camp. She thought about a mother in Stuttgart, alone in an apartment, staring at a notification of death, her son's belongings packed away, her future empty of the one person who had given it meaning. She thought about what her own mother would want someone to do if the situations were reversed, and just like that, the decision was made. "Klaus," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "I might be able to help you, but you must tell no one at all. Do you understand?" Klaus looked at her, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Help? How can you help?" "The rules, they are very strict." Margaret glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. "There are ways. I can mail a letter for you, from outside the camp, from a civilian address. It might reach her. I cannot promise, but it might work." Klaus stared at her as though she had spoken in a language he did not know. "Why? Why would you do this? You are American. Your people, they fight my people. Why would you help me?" Margaret met his eyes, and in that moment she told him the truth. Because if my son were captured, if he were held somewhere and could not write home, I would pray to God that someone, somewhere, would show him this same mercy. Because you are someone's son before you are anyone's enemy. Because your mother deserves to know you are alive." Klaus's eyes filled with tears, and this time he did not try to hide them. They spilled down his cheeks, silent and unstoppable, the release of 8 months of helpless despair. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only a broken sound that was half sob, half laugh. Margaret reached out and briefly touched his arm, a gesture that could have gotten her expelled from the camp if a guard saw it. Then she stepped back, her voice dropping even lower. "Write your letter, in German if you must. Hide it in a library book when you return it tomorrow. I will find it, translate it, and mail it under my name. We will figure out the rest as we go." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him one more time. "And Klaus, if anyone asks, we never had this conversation. For both our sakes." Klaus nodded, unable to speak, his hand pressed against his chest as though holding his heart inside. Margaret walked away across the compound, her mind already racing through the logistics, the risks, the impossibility of what she had just agreed to do. Behind her, Klaus Bergman stood by the fence, staring after her, a German prisoner of war who had just been offered a lifeline by the wife of an American cowboy. And somewhere in Stuttgart, in an apartment on Schillerstrasse, a mother named Helene Bergman stood at a window, watching the street, waiting for a son she believed was dead, not knowing that across an ocean and a continent, a stranger was about to break every rule to bring her a miracle. The war had made them enemies. But in that dusty yard in Texas, something stronger than war had just been born, a conspiracy of mercy, a rebellion of the heart, and it would change everything. The conspiracy began in earnest on a cold November morning, 3 days after Margaret's promise to Klaus. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of central Texas grassland where cattle grazed beneath skies so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. It was here, far from the watchful eyes of camp guards and administrators, that the real work would begin. Klaus arrived with a work detail of 8 prisoners, transported in the back of an army truck to help mend fences along the eastern pasture. The labor shortage had made such arrangements common. Ranchers paid the government for prisoner labor, and the POWs earned small credits they could spend in the camp canteen. It was a system that benefited everyone, and it provided Margaret with the perfect opportunity to speak with Klaus away from the crowded compound. She waited until the men had been working for an hour, until the guard, a board corporal named Jenkins, had settled into his usual routine of sitting in the truck cab, reading a magazine and smoking cigarettes. The November wind carried voices away, and the vastness of the land provided a privacy that no prison wall could offer. Margaret approached Klaus as he worked alone on a section of barbed wire, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent his life working with tools. She carried a canteen of water and a basket of sandwiches, her excuse for being there, though her heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Klaus," she said quietly, kneeling beside him as though inspecting his work, "we need to talk about the details." He glanced up, his eyes darting toward the truck where Jenkins sat, oblivious. "Here? Is it safe?" "Safe enough." Margaret kept her voice low, her hands busy checking the fence post as though that were her only concern. "Listen carefully. You will write your letters in German. I do not care if I can read every word. Write from your heart. Write what you need to say. Hide the letters in the library books when you return them. I will find them, translate them as best I can, and rewrite them in English." Klaus's hands stilled on the wire. "In English? But my mother, she does not read English very well." Margaret had thought of this. "The letters will say they are from a pen pal program, a cultural exchange between Texas and Germany to promote understanding. I will write that I am translating your words for you. It will seem official, legitimate. The censors in Germany, if they even look at mail coming from America, will see nothing suspicious." Klaus shook his head slowly, conflict written across his face. "Mrs. Hayes, if you are caught, what will happen to you? This is not small thing. This is, what is the word, illegal?" "Very illegal," Margaret confirmed, her voice steady despite the fear that lived in her chest like a small, cold stone. "But your mother deserves to know you are alive, and I made you a promise But why? Klaus's voice cracked slightly. Why risk so much for me? For German prisoner? Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the uniform and the accent and the designation of enemy. She saw a young man with oil permanently stained under his fingernails from years of mechanical work. She saw someone's son, someone's whole world, separated by war and circumstance from the person who loved him most. Because, she said quietly, if my son Robert is ever in your position, captured and alone and unable to reach me, I pray to God that someone, somewhere, would show him this same mercy. Because before you are German and I am American, before any of this war and hatred and death, we are all just people who love our families. Klaus's eyes filled, but he blinked hard, fighting the tears. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if something happens to you because of this? What if your son, he comes home and you are in prison because you helped the enemy? How could I live with that? Margaret smiled, though it held more sadness than joy. Then we will be very careful not to get caught. Over the next hour, working side by side as Corporal Jenkins dozed in the truck, they hammered out the system that would govern their secret correspondence for the next 3 years. Klaus would write his letters on whatever paper he could acquire in camp, folding them small and tight. Margaret distributed library books twice a week, and Klaus would hide his letters in the spines of books he returned, carefully sliding them between the binding and the pages where they would not be immediately visible. Margaret would take the books home, extract the letters, and spend her evenings translating them with the help of a German-English dictionary she had quietly purchased from a bookstore in Austin. Her German was rudimentary at best, learned from phrases she had picked up from the prisoners during her volunteer work, but she would do her best to capture the meaning, the emotion, the essential truth of what Klaus needed to say. She would then rewrite the letters in English on her own stationery, composing them as though she were a volunteer with a fictional cultural exchange program. The return address would read, M. Hayes, Cultural Exchange Program, Austin, Texas. Vague enough to seem official, specific enough to provide a destination for replies. The letters would be mailed from different towns during Margaret's supply runs. She drove to neighboring communities regularly to purchase feed, equipment, and household goods. A letter posted from Bastrop one week, from Elgin the next, from Taylor the week after. Nothing that would establish a pattern, nothing that would draw attention. And if replies came back, which Margaret prayed they would, she would bring them to camp hidden in the same library books, a reverse journey that would complete the circuit of communication. It was risky. It was complicated. It was perhaps the most dangerous thing Margaret had ever agreed to do. But as she looked at Klaus's face, at the hope dawning there like sunrise after the longest night, she knew she could not turn back now. That evening, alone in her kitchen after the prisoners had been returned to camp, Margaret sat at the table with a German-English dictionary, 3 blank sheets of writing paper, and Klaus's first letter. She had found it exactly where he promised, tucked into the spine of a battered copy of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, folded so small it was barely thicker than a matchbook. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, seeing Klaus's careful handwriting, the German words that meant nothing and everything to her. She could not read the language fluently, but she understood enough to catch certain words. Mutter, mother, Leben, life, Hoffnung, hope. For 3 hours, Margaret worked by lamplight, moving between the letter and the dictionary, writing down possible translations, crossing them out, trying again. It was painstaking work, and she knew her translation would be imperfect, that nuances would be lost, that Klaus's eloquence in his native language would be reduced to simpler phrases in hers. But she captured the heart of it. She captured his joy at being alive, his sorrow at being separated, his desperate need for his mother to know he was safe and well treated. She captured his love, which needed no translation, which lived in every carefully formed letter of every word. When she finished, Margaret had a letter that read, My dearest Mama, this volunteer Mrs. Hayes writes my words for me, as I have not the English yet to write myself. I am alive. I am in Texas, America, in a prisoner camp where they treat us fairly and feed us well. I think of you every day. Please write back so I know you received this. Please tell me you are alive and safe. I love you more than all the words in any language. Your son, Klaus. Simple, direct, true. Margaret addressed the envelope in her own handwriting. Frau Helene Bergmann, Schillerstrasse 17, Stuttgart, Germany. In the return address corner, she wrote, Monsieur Hayes, Cultural Exchange Program, Post Office Box 327, Austin, Texas. The next morning, she drove 30 miles to Taylor and mailed the letter from the post office there, telling the clerk she was corresponding with a German family as part of a church outreach program. The clerk, an elderly woman with kind eyes, smiled and said it was a Christian thing to do, to reach out to former enemies in the spirit of healing. Margaret paid for the postage with coins that felt heavier than they should, each one a small weight of hope and fear. Then she drove home, wondering if she had just committed an act of mercy or treason, and whether history would know the difference. 3 months passed. Winter deepened, then softened into the tentative warmth of early spring. Margaret continued her volunteer work at Camp Swift, distributing books, teaching English, serving coffee, all while carrying the secret of what she had done like a stone in her pocket, heavy and hidden. Klaus said nothing to her directly during those months. They had agreed that any acknowledgement in public would be dangerous. But sometimes, when she handed him a book during library distribution, their eyes would meet for just a moment, and she would see the question there. Anything? Any reply? And week after week she had to shake her head minutely. Nothing yet. Margaret began to fear the letter had been lost or intercepted, or that Klaus's mother had indeed died, and the letter had arrived at an empty apartment to be thrown away by strangers. She began to fear that she had given Klaus false hope, which was perhaps crueler than no hope at all. But then, on a rainy afternoon in late March of 1945, Margaret found an envelope in her mailbox addressed in shaky handwriting to Monsieur Hayes, Cultural Exchange Program. The return address was Stuttgart, Germany. The envelope had been opened and resealed with tape marked by censors in both Germany and the United States, but it had survived the journey. Margaret's hands shook so violently she could barely open it. Inside, on thin paper that had been folded and refolded many times, was a letter written in German. But even without translation, Margaret could see the tear stains, could see where the ink had run, could feel the emotion, radiating from every word. She took the letter immediately to her kitchen, pulled out her dictionary, and began the laborious process of translation. What emerged, word by painstaking word, was this: Klaus, my son, my heart, my life. They told me you were dead. I held a memorial service. I gave away your clothes. I wanted to die myself. And now this letter comes, this impossible letter, and I do not know if I am awake or dreaming. Are you truly alive? Can this be real? Please write again quickly so I know this is not my mind playing tricks from grief. I am sick still, but I will not die now. I cannot die now, not when you are alive somewhere. Thank you to the American woman who writes for you. May God bless her for her kindness. I love you, I love you, I love you. Your Mama. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and wept. She wept for Helene Bergmann, who had buried her son and now had him returned to her by words on paper. She wept for Klaus, who would soon know his mother lived. She wept for her own son, Robert, somewhere in the Pacific, and prayed that someone, somewhere, would show him mercy if he needed it. And then she dried her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and hid it in a library book to smuggle into camp the next day. When Klaus found his mother's letter tucked into a collection of Whitman poems, he was in the camp library, surrounded by other prisoners engaged in quiet reading and writing. Margaret watched from across the room as he opened the book, as his hands found the folded paper, as recognition and disbelief flooded his face. Klaus read the letter once, twice, 3 times. Then, his composure, held so carefully for so many months, simply shattered. He bent over the table, his shoulders shaking with sobs that he tried desperately to muffle, tears falling onto the page in his hands. Other prisoners noticed. Conversations stopped. Men looked over, concerned at first, then understanding as they saw what Klaus held. One of them, an older prisoner named Friedrich, moved to Klaus's side and placed a hand on his shoulder. Klaus looked up at him, eyes streaming, and managed to choke out 2 words in German. Sigh leaped. She lives. The news spread through the library in whispers. Men who had maintained careful emotional distance, who had survived captivity by not hoping for too much, suddenly saw what was possible. Klaus's mother was alive. Klaus had reached her. Communication, that most basic human need, had somehow penetrated the barriers of war and regulation and distance, and they began to wonder if they too might find a way to reach home. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 other prisoners approached Margaret quietly during her volunteer sessions. Each had a story similar to Klaus's. Letters that had been rejected. Families in restricted zones, mothers or wives who believed them dead, and each asked with varying degrees of desperation and shame if she might help them too. There was Werner, a farmer from Bavaria whose wife had given birth to their first child 2 months after he was captured. He had never seen his daughter, did not even know her name. There was Heinrich, a schoolteacher from Hamburg who had received word through the Red Cross that his elderly parents had survived the bombing of their neighborhood, but he could not write to them because their new address was in a military district. And there was young Peter, barely 20, from a village outside Berlin, whose sister had been his only family. His letters to her were returned, stamped with notices that the address no longer existed, that the building had been destroyed, but he had no way of knowing if she had survived. Margaret knew she should say no. Each additional prisoner increased the risk exponentially. Each new letter was another thread that could unravel and expose everything. She had a system that worked for Klaus, barely, and expanding it was madness. But she looked at Werner and saw her own husband, Thomas, who had missed so much of their son's early years because of work and war. She looked at Heinrich and thought of her own aging parents. She looked at Peter and saw David, her youngest, who would be lost without his brother. "If my son is captured somewhere," she had told Klaus, "I pray someone shows him this same mercy." How could she show mercy to one and deny it to others? So she agreed. 4 prisoners now, 4 sets of letters to translate, rewrite, and mail from different locations under different pretexts. 4 families waiting in the ruins of Germany for word that would not come through official channels. The workload was staggering. Margaret spent her evenings hunched over her kitchen table, dictionary open, letters spread before her, translating and rewriting until her eyes burned and her hand cramped. She drove longer distances to mail the letters to Taylor and Manor and Lockhart and Georgetown, never the same post office twice in a row, always with a story ready about church programs or cultural exchanges or educational initiatives. She purchased additional stamps in small quantities from different locations so no single postmaster would notice unusual volume. She varied her handwriting slightly for each set of letters, making them appear to come from different volunteers. She created 4 different fictional return addresses, all variations on the cultural exchange program theme, all routing back to the same post office box in Austin that she checked 3 times a week. The fear was constant now, a low hum beneath everything else she did. Every time she approached her mailbox, she feared finding not letters from Germany, but official notices from the military. Every time a car pulled up to the ranch, she expected Army investigators. Every time the phone rang, her heart seized. And then came the moment that nearly ended everything. It was a Tuesday in April when Corporal Jenkins, the guard who supervised most of the work details at the Hayes Ranch, decided to inspect the Oz library books before the prisoners loaded them into the truck for return to camp. It was not standard procedure, just a whim, a moment of boredom perhaps, or a flicker of suspicion. Margaret watched in frozen horror as Jenkins picked up a copy of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, the very book where Werner had hidden his latest letter to his wife. The corporal flipped through the pages casually, and Margaret saw the moment when the folded paper began to slip from the spine. Without thinking, she stepped forward and sneezed, loudly and dramatically, drawing Jenkins's attention. "Excuse me," she said, pulling a handkerchief from her pocket and making a show of wiping her nose. "These spring allergies are just terrible. Do you suffer from them, Corporal?" Jenkins, startled and slightly disgusted by the display, set the book down quickly and stepped back. "Can't say I do, ma'am. You should probably get inside, away from all this pollen." "Yes, you are probably right." Margaret moved between Jenkins and the box of books, making a production of her sneezing fit, until the corporal decided he had fulfilled his supervisory duties and returned to the truck. The letter stayed hidden. The books were loaded. The prisoners were returned to camp. But Margaret's hands shook for an hour afterward, and she knew they had been seconds away from discovery, from questions neither she nor the prisoners could answer. That night, when Thomas came home from a 2-week trip to the factories in Houston, he found Margaret at the kitchen table, surrounded by letters, dictionary, and German writing she had not hidden quickly enough. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene. Then he closed the door behind him and said quietly, "Margaret, what have you done?" And she knew the secret had just grown larger, more complicated, more dangerous than ever. Her husband knew. And now she would have to trust that the man she married would understand why she had risked everything for 4 German prisoners and the families who loved them. The conspiracy that had begun with a promise in a dusty prison yard had just reached a point of no return. And Margaret Hayes, rancher's wife and mother of 2, had become something she never imagined she would be. A smuggler of hope across enemy lines, a rebel against regulations written in the name of security. And perhaps, though she would never use the word herself, a traitor who believed that some laws were less important than the fundamental human right to tell your mother you are still alive. Thomas Hayes stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, travel bag still in hand, staring at his wife surrounded by evidence of something he could not quite process. German letters, an open dictionary, Margaret's handwriting on papers addressed to families in Stuttgart and Hamburg and Berlin. The kitchen table had become a command center for an operation he had never suspected, and the woman he had been married to for 20 years suddenly seemed like a stranger. How long? His voice was quiet, controlled in the way men speak when they are working very hard not to shout. How long have you been doing this? Margaret's first instinct was to lie, to minimize, to protect him from the full scope of what she had done. But she was so tired of secrets, so exhausted from months of living 2 lives, that the truth simply spilled out. Since November. 4 prisoners. Their families think they're dead. The letters get rejected because of restricted zones, and I couldn't let them, Thomas. I couldn't let those mothers not know their sons were alive. Thomas set his bag down slowly and walked to the table, picking up one of the letters Margaret had been translating. He stared at it for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, understanding the system, recognizing the risks. "Do you have any idea what they would do to you if they found out?" His voice rose now, fear overtaking control. "Margaret, this isn't just breaking camp rules. This is potentially espionage, aiding enemy communications, violating federal wartime regulations. They could arrest you. They could charge you with treason." "I know." Margaret's voice was steady, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I know all of that. But Thomas, one of those prisoners is 20 years old. 20. His mother held a funeral for him, and all he wants, all any of them want, is to tell their families they're alive." Thomas sat down heavily in the chair across from her, rubbing his face with both hands. "Our son is out there somewhere, fighting these people. Your brother died fighting these people, and you're helping them." "I'm helping their mothers," Margaret said quietly. "There's a difference." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the secret settling between them like a third presence in the room. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his voice raw. "If they catch you, if something happens to you because of this, how am I supposed to explain it to Robert and David? How am I supposed to tell our sons that their mother is in prison because she helped German prisoners?" Margaret looked at her husband, this man who had worked himself to exhaustion to support the war effort, who had missed years of their sons' lives because duty called him to factories and contracts and the endless machinery of wartime production. She chose her words carefully. "If Robert is ever captured, if he's ever alone and afraid and unable to reach us, wouldn't you want someone to help him? Even if it was dangerous, even if it was illegal?" Thomas's jaw tightened, and she saw the moment her words hit their mark, saw him imagine their son in a Japanese prison camp, desperate and alone. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not fair." "No," Margaret agreed. "None of this is fair. But it's happening anyway, and I have to live with myself after this war ends. I have to be able to look at my own reflection and know I did what I believed was right." Another long silence stretched between them, Then Thomas reached across the table and took one of the German letters, studying it with the analytical eye he brought to engineering problems and business contracts. How does the system work? Show me everything, and so Margaret did. She showed him the library books, the hiding places, the translation process. She showed him the post office box in Austin, the multiple return addresses, the careful rotation of mailing locations. She showed him letters from mothers in Germany, their gratitude and desperation written in shaky handwriting on thin paper. Thomas listened to it all, asking questions about security, about timing, about what would happen if the prisoners were transferred or repatriated. And gradually, Margaret realized he was not building a case against her. He was trying to understand how to help. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Texas night. When he turned back, his face was set with a decision that frightened and relieved her in equal measure. I traveled to Dallas twice a month, Houston every 3 weeks, sometimes San Antonio. I can mail letters from there. Different cities, different post offices, no pattern for anyone to trace back to us. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Thomas, you don't have to do this. This is my choice, my risk. He moved back to the table and took her hand. If you get caught, we'll face it together. That's what we promised each other 20 years ago, for better or worse. I think this probably counts as worse, and just like that, the conspiracy doubled in size and strength. Thomas became the silent partner in Margaret's operation, using his business travels to expand their mailing network across half of Texas. The letters now came from Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Corpus Christi, a geographic spread that made patterns harder to trace and suspicions harder to justify. But then, on the 8th of May, 1945, everything changed. The news came through on radios across America, crackling with static and jubilation. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Cities erupted in celebration. Strangers embraced in the streets. Church bells rang until their tongues were sore. Victory in Europe. VE Day. The long nightmare was ending. At Camp Swift, the German prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Their nation had been defeated. The Reich they had fought for had collapsed. Everything they had believed about German superiority, about inevitable victory, about their place in history, had been proven false. Some wept. Others sat in numb shock. A few seemed almost relieved that the burden of fighting was finally over. But for Klaus and Werner and Heinrich and Peter and the others Margaret had been helping, surrender brought a new terror. What would happen to them now? When would they be sent home? And more frightening still, what would they be going home to? The letters from Germany grew darker. Klaus's mother wrote that Stuttgart was rubble and ash, that she was living in the basement of a destroyed building with 7 other families, that food was scarce and winter would be deadly. Werner's wife described finding work as a translator for American occupation forces, just to earn enough to feed their daughter. Heinrich's parents wrote that Hamburg had burned, that thousands had died in the firestorms, that the city was a wasteland of brick and bone. And Peter received no reply at all. His letters to his sister came back marked, "Addressee unknown, building destroyed." He did not know if she was alive, dead, or simply lost in the chaos of a shattered nation. The letters became more than communication now. They became lifelines for families facing starvation and chaos. And Margaret, reading the desperate pleas from German mothers and wives, knew she had to do more. She began including small packages with her letters, dried beef wrapped in wax paper, vitamin tablets from the pharmacy in Austin, packets of powdered milk, small tins of coffee worth more than gold in occupied Germany. She marked them as book donations, educational materials, cultural exchange supplies, anything that might let them slip through customs and censorship. Thomas helped, using his business connections to acquire supplies that were rationed for civilians, but more readily available through commercial channels. Other ranchers' wives, carefully vetted and sworn to secrecy, began contributing. A conspiracy of mercy was growing, spreading like roots beneath the surface where authorities could not see. But it was in the letters themselves that the deepest transformation occurred. Margaret had started this as a simple act of mercy, facilitating communication between sons and mothers. But as months passed and the war ended, and the prisoners remained in Texas through the summer and fall of 1945, something unexpected happened. She and Klaus became friends. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Klaus began including personal notes from Margaret at the end of his letters to his mother, thanking her, asking about her family, sharing observations about Texas and America that he could not put in official correspondence. Margaret found herself responding, sharing her own fears about Robert still fighting in the Pacific, her grief over her brother James, her hopes for what the world might become when the killing finally stopped. Klaus told her about his mother's sacrifices, how she had worked herself to exhaustion in the textile mill so he could attend technical school, how she had gone without food so he could eat, how she had never remarried after his father's death, had devoted her entire life to raising him well and safely. Margaret told him about Robert's last letter, how he had written about the fear that lived in every soldier's chest, the guilt of surviving when friends died, the desperate hope that the world they were fighting for would be worth the cost. She told him about James, who had been her protector when they were children, who had taught her to ride and rope and stand up for herself, who had gone to Normandy and never come home. They shared the strange intimacy of people who had been through fire together, who had trusted each other with secrets that could destroy them both. The barrier of enemy and ally dissolved slowly, replaced by something more fundamental. Two people trying to preserve humanity in a world that seemed determined to burn it away. The cowboys on the Hayes Ranch noticed Margaret's growing attachment to the prisoners, particularly Klaus. They saw how she lingered during the work details, how she brought extra water and sandwiches, how her face lit up when the truck arrived with the prisoner work crews. Some muttered disapproval. Others, older men who had seen war themselves, understood that things were rarely as simple as enemy and friend. One afternoon in July, as the Texas heat beat down like a physical weight, one of the older cowboys named Bill approached Margaret while she was distributing water to the prisoners. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're doing with these boys, and I don't want to know. But I fought in the first war, and I learned something then. War makes enemies. Peace requires something harder. It requires seeing the other fellow as human again. Whatever you're doing, I hope it's on the side of peace." Margaret looked at him, this weathered man who had seen his own share of killing, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Bill." He tipped his hat and walked away, and she knew she had at least one ally who would ask no questions and tell no tales. But the security around POW correspondence was tightening. In August, Army investigators began cracking down on unauthorized communications with prisoners, concerned about intelligence leaks and propaganda efforts. Several camps reported discovering illegal mail operations, and punishments were severe. Prisoners were put in isolation. Civilian collaborators were arrested. Margaret received a visit from a camp administrator in September, a stern-faced captain who asked pointed questions about her volunteer work, her interactions with prisoners, her mail habits. Did she correspond with anyone in Germany? Had any prisoners asked her to mail letters? Had she noticed any suspicious behavior? She lied with a smoothness that frightened her. She explained that she wrote to several American soldiers overseas through a church pen pal program, which accounted for her postage expenses. She insisted she never spoke privately with prisoners, only in supervised educational settings. She projected the image of a patriotic rancher's wife doing her part for the war effort, nothing more. The captain seemed satisfied, but he warned her that fraternization with prisoners was viewed with increasing suspicion, that volunteers needed to maintain appropriate distance and remember these were enemy soldiers, not friends. Margaret nodded and promised to be more careful, all while hiding letters in her jacket pocket that she would mail from Georgetown that afternoon. By winter of 1945, the repatriation process finally began. But it was slow, bureaucratic, complicated by the chaos of occupied Germany and the sheer number of prisoners to process and transport. Klaus and the others were transferred to larger processing camps, first to Hearne, then to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, as they waited for ships that would take them home. The transfers made everything more complicated. Margaret could no longer rely on library books and ranch work details. She had to find new intermediaries, trusted people in other towns who could collect and deliver letters without asking too many questions. The network expanded to include a librarian in San Antonio, a pastor's wife in Hearn, a Red Cross volunteer in Houston. Each new person was a risk. Each expansion of the network increased the chances of discovery. But the letters had to continue because the situation in Germany was growing more desperate with every week that passed. Klaus's mother wrote in January of 1946 that she was surviving on 600 calories a day, that she had sold everything she owned for food, that the cold was killing people faster than the bombs ever had. She begged Klaus to find a way to stay in America, to not come home to the graveyard Germany had become. Werner learned his wife was sick, possibly tuberculosis, but could not get treatment because the hospitals were overwhelmed and medicine was scarce. Heinrich's father died in December, and his mother's letter was barely legible, written in a hand that shook with grief and hunger. And Peter finally received word about his sister. She was alive, working as a nurse in Berlin, but living in conditions he could barely comprehend. His letters to her became desperate pleas for her to survive just a little longer, to hold on until he could find a way to help her. Margaret coordinated with Thomas and their growing network of helpers to send more packages, more food, more medicine. They worked with church groups who were organizing relief efforts for Germany, secretly funneling supplies to specific families while maintaining the appearance of general charitable work. The emotional toll was staggering. Margaret spent her days working the ranch and her evenings translating letters filled with suffering and desperation. She lost weight. She slept poorly. Thomas found her crying at the kitchen table more than once, overwhelmed by the weight of other people's grief. But she could not stop. She had made promises to 4 young men who had trusted her with their most precious connection to home. Those promises had expanded to 10, then 12, then 15 prisoners whose families depended on the letters and packages that arrived from a mysterious cultural exchange program in Texas. And in the spring of 1946, as Klaus finally received his orders for repatriation, as he prepared to board a ship that would take him back across the Atlantic to a homeland he barely recognized, he wrote Margaret one final letter that would never go through official channels. Mrs. Hayes, he wrote in halting English he had learned during his time in Texas, "You saved my mother's life. You saved my heart when I thought there was nothing left to save. I do not know if I will ever see you again, but I will never forget what you did for me. You showed me that there are people in this world who choose mercy over hatred, who see humans instead of enemies. You taught me that America is not what the propaganda said. It is better. It is you. Thank you. Forever, Klaus." Margaret read those words in her kitchen, and she wept for everything they had been through, for all the fear and secrecy and risk. She wept for Klaus going home to ruins, for his mother who had waited so long, for all the families torn apart by war and struggling to find each other in the aftermath. But she also felt something else. Pride, purpose, the certainty that she had done the right thing, regardless of the cost, regardless of the risk. The war had ended, but the letters had continued, because mercy does not end when the shooting stops. Mercy is what allows enemies to become humans again, what allows healing to begin, what allows mothers and sons separated by violence to find their way back to each other. And Margaret Hayes, rancher's wife and secret rebel, had become an architect of that mercy, one letter at a time. The spring of 1947 brought change that felt both inevitable and impossible. The ships finally came, massive transports that would carry thousands of German prisoners back across the Atlantic to a homeland many no longer recognized. Klaus Bergmann stood on the deck of one such vessel, watching the coast of America disappear into the horizon, carrying with him memories of Texas that would never fade, and letters from Margaret Hayes that he had preserved like sacred texts. The correspondence did not end with his departure. If anything, it intensified. Now the letters traveled truly international routes, crossing an ocean without the complications of prison camp censorship. Margaret could write directly to Klaus and his mother, and they could respond without fear of rejection or discovery. The secret was no longer illegal, merely private, a connection between families that war had brought together in the strangest of ways. Klaus's first letters from Germany painted a picture so bleak that Margaret sometimes had to stop reading and collect herself before continuing. Stuttgart was ruins upon ruins, he wrote. Buildings reduced to hollow shells, streets choked with rubble that would take years to clear. The apartment on Schillerstrasse where he'd grown up no longer existed. In its place was a crater and the twisted remains of what had once been homes. His mother had survived, but barely. She was living with 6 other families in the basement of a partially destroyed school, sharing 2 rooms and a single working toilet. Food was desperately scarce. The occupation authorities provided rations, but they were not enough. People were starving slowly, their bodies consuming themselves, their faces becoming masks of bone and shadow. But in every letter, no matter how dark the descriptions of physical devastation, Klaus included messages of gratitude that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "My mother speaks of you constantly," he wrote. "She tells everyone about the American woman who refused to let her son disappear into silence. She says you saved not just my life, but my soul. She says you proved that goodness exists even in the darkest times." Margaret responded with packages now sent through official relief channels. The war was over, the regulations lifted, and she could openly mail food and medicine and clothing to Germany without fear of arrest. She coordinated with church groups and relief organizations, directing supplies to specific families while maintaining her fiction of general charitable work. Thomas helped, using his business connections to acquire goods that were still rationed for regular civilians. The packages became a lifeline. Klaus's mother wrote that the dried milk Margaret sent had saved 3 children in their basement shelter, that the vitamin tablets had helped an elderly man survive pneumonia, that the coffee, which she could trade for other necessities, had become a currency more valuable than the rapidly devaluing Reichsmark. "You cannot know what these gifts mean," Helene Bergman wrote in halting English, that Klaus had helped her compose. "In a world where everything is destroyed, where we have nothing, these packages are hope made physical. They are proof that we are not forgotten, that someone across the ocean remembers we are human beings who deserve to live." The letters continued through 1947 and into 48. Klaus found work as a mechanic, using skills he had learned before the war and refined during his time in the Africa Corps. The pay was minimal, the conditions difficult, but it was work, and work meant survival. He saved every pfennig he could spare, hoarding money in a tin can hidden beneath the floorboards of the basement room he shared with his mother. He was saving for something Margaret did not yet know about, something that would take 3 years of deprivation and sacrifice and determination. He was saving for passage to America. The summer of 1949 arrived hot and dry across central Texas. Margaret was in her kitchen, preparing lunch and listening to the radio, when she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the long drive to the ranch house. She looked out the window, expecting to see Thomas returning from town or one of the ranch hands coming in for a meal. Instead, she saw an old truck she did not recognize, dust-covered and rattling, pulling to a stop in front of the house. The driver's door opened, and a young man stepped out, taller and broader than she remembered, but unmistakable in the way he moved, in the shape of his face, in the careful way he turned to help an elderly woman from the passenger seat. Klaus Bergman. And beside him, leaning heavily on his arm, was a woman so thin she seemed made of paper and will, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dress clean but worn to threads. Helene Bergman. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The wooden spoon she had been holding clattered to the floor. For a moment she could not move, could not breathe, could only stand frozen in disbelief at the impossible sight before her. Then she was moving, running out the door and across the yard, her apron still tied around her waist, her hair escaping from its pins. Klaus saw her coming, and his face broke into a smile so wide and genuine it transformed him from the haunted prisoner she had known into someone young and whole and alive with joy. "Mrs. Hayes," he called out, his English heavily accented but clear. "We have come to say thank you." Margaret reached them and stopped, suddenly uncertain. 3 years of letters, 3 years of shared secrets and risks and trust, and now here they stood in the flesh, no longer abstractions or ink on paper, but real human beings in her yard. She did not know whether to shake hands or embrace, whether to laugh or cry, whether any of this was really happening. Helene Bergman solved the problem. She released Klaus's arm and stepped forward on unsteady legs, her hands reaching out to take Margaret's face between her palms. Her eyes, bright and fierce despite her frailty, searched Margaret's face as though memorizing every detail. "You," she said in broken English that Klaus had clearly helped her practice. "You gave me my son when world took everything. You gave hope when there was only darkness. How do I thank you for this? How do I say what is in my heart?" And then she was crying, and Margaret was crying, and they were holding each other in the Texas sun, two mothers separated by language and nationality and an ocean, but united by something deeper than any of those divisions. Behind them, Klaus wept openly, no longer the prisoner who had to hide his emotions, no longer the enemy who had to maintain dignity in captivity. Thomas came out of the barn, drawn by the commotion, and stopped short at the sight of his wife embracing a German woman, while a young man he vaguely recognized watched with tears streaming down his face. Margaret looked up and saw her husband, saw the question in his eyes, and smiled through her tears. "Thomas," she said, "these are our friends, Klaus and Helene Bergman. They've come a very long way." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face, and he walked forward with his hand extended. "Welcome to Texas," he said simply. "You're welcome in our home for as long as you want to stay." They stayed for 3 days. 3 days of conversation and laughter and tears, of stories shared and memories revisited, of boundaries erased and connections deepened. Klaus told them about the journey, how he had saved for 3 years, working every hour he could, taking on extra jobs, living on almost nothing so he could afford passage for himself and his mother on a cargo ship that accepted passengers. How they had arrived in New York and taken buses across the country, sleeping in cheap boarding houses and eating the cheapest food they could find, determined to reach Texas, determined to thank Margaret in person. Helene spoke through Klaus's translation, telling Margaret things that had been too painful or too personal to put in letters. How she had considered suicide when she received the notification that Klaus was missing and presumed dead. How she had stood on a bridge in Stuttgart, ready to jump, and had been stopped only by the memory of Klaus's last words to her before he left for Africa. "Live, Mama. Promise me you'll live." "And then your letter came," Helene said, gripping Margaret's hand so tightly it hurt. "Your letter that said he was alive, that he was safe, that he thought of me every day. I read that letter, and I knew I had to keep my promise. I had to live so that one day I could see him again." Margaret told them about Robert, who had come home from the Pacific, changed by what he had seen, quieter and sadder, but alive. About David, who had joined the army after all, but had been stationed in Germany during the occupation, helping to rebuild the very nation he had been raised to see as the enemy. About the other prisoners she had helped, the 15 families she had connected through letters and packages, the small network of mercy she had built one envelope at a time. On the 3rd evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the Texas plains, Helene told Margaret something that would change everything. "This story must be told," she said firmly. "People must know what you did, not for your glory, but so others understand that there is always choice, even in war, always choice to be cruel or kind, to hate or to help." Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, Helene. It was illegal what I did. I could still face consequences. And I did not do it for recognition. I did it because it was right." But Helene was insistent. Because it was right is exactly why people must know. Too many people think war makes monsters of us all, that there is no room for kindness when nations fight. Your story proves this is lie. Your story gives hope. After Klaus and Helene left, continuing their journey to visit other families Klaus had known in the camps, Helene did exactly what she had promised. She wrote to the local newspapers in Austin and San Antonio, telling the story in her careful English that Klaus had helped her compose. She wrote about a son who could not reach his mother, about an American woman who broke rules to reunite them, about mercy that transcended national boundaries. The story appeared first in the Austin American-Statesman in August of 1949. The headline read, "Rancher's wife defied army rules to reunite German POW with dying mother." The article included quotes from Helene, from Klaus, and from Margaret, who reluctantly agreed to be interviewed when she realized the story was going to run with or without her cooperation. The response was immediate and divided. Letters poured into the newspaper office, some praising Margaret as a hero of compassion, others condemning her as a traitor who had aided the enemy. Veterans groups were split, some outraged that she had violated regulations, others deeply moved by her willingness to help suffering families regardless of nationality. The story spread to other papers. The San Antonio Express picked it up, then the Dallas Morning News, then regional papers across Texas and beyond. Within weeks, Margaret Hayes was receiving mail from across the country, some supportive, some hateful, all passionate in their conviction about whether what she had done was heroic or treasonous. And then the Army came calling. 2 military investigators arrived at the ranch in September, polite but formal, asking questions about her volunteer work at Camp Swift, about her correspondence with German families, about possible violations of POW communication protocols. They informed her that regulations had been violated, that there could be consequences, that they were conducting a full investigation. Margaret sat across from them in her living room and told the truth. Yes, she had helped prisoners mail letters that had been rejected through official channels. Yes, she had translated and rewritten correspondence to circumvent censorship. Yes, she had known it was illegal and had done it anyway. Why? One of the investigators asked. Margaret looked at him steadily. Because if my son had been captured, I would have prayed for someone to show him the same mercy. Because those prisoners were sons and husbands and fathers before they were enemies. Because some things are more important than regulations. The investigation continued for 3 months, but something unexpected happened. The community rallied. Ranchers and cowboys came forward to testify to Margaret's character, to her tireless work supporting the war effort, to the lives she had touched. Bill, the old cowboy who had fought in the First War, wrote a letter to the Army explaining that what Margaret had done was not betrayal, but the highest form of loyalty. Loyalty to the values America claimed to represent. Former guards from Camp Swift, including Corporal Jenkins, provided statements saying they had never seen Margaret do anything that compromised security, that she had always acted with integrity and care. And from Germany, affidavits arrived from the 15 families she had helped, testimonies of gratitude and love for the woman, who had refused to let war destroy human connection. Public opinion shifted. What had started as controversy became a referendum on the meaning of mercy, on whether compassion for enemy soldiers could coexist with patriotism, on what kind of nation America wanted to be in the aftermath of the most devastating war in human history. In December of 1949, the Army quietly dropped its investigation. The official statement cited the war's end, the lack of any actual security breach, and Margaret's otherwise exemplary conduct. Unofficially, investigators acknowledged that prosecuting a woman for reuniting mothers and sons would be a public relations disaster no one wanted. Letters of support and gratitude continued to arrive at the Hayes Ranch for years. Dozens of German families wrote to thank Margaret for inspiring Klaus to help them, for creating a network that had saved lives during the desperate years after the war. American veterans wrote to say her story had helped them see their former enemies as human beings again, had helped them process their own experiences and find peace. And in 1952, Klaus Bergmann returned to America permanently. He had saved enough money to sponsor his mother's immigration, and together they settled in San Antonio, where Klaus opened a small mechanics shop. When his first daughter was born in 1954, he named her Margaret and asked Margaret Hayes to be her godmother. The two families became intertwined, celebrating holidays together, supporting each other through the decades that followed. When Helene Bergman died in 1961, Margaret Hayes spoke at her funeral, telling the story of a mother's love that had survived war and separation and impossible odds. The years passed. The story of Margaret's wartime mercy faded from headlines, but lived on in the communities that had been touched by it. Other stories emerged, other tales of small kindnesses between captors and prisoners, other examples of people who had chosen humanity over hatred during those complicated years when enemy soldiers had lived and worked alongside the Americans they had fought against. And then, on a warm spring evening in 1968, Margaret Hayes stood on a stage in Austin, Texas, before an audience gathered by the German-American Friendship Society. She was 71 years old now, her hair completely gray, her hands marked by age and work. Beside her stood Klaus Bergman, 52 now, successful and settled, his teenage daughter Margaret at his side. Klaus held two framed letters. The first was the rejected envelope from 1944, still marked with red stamps declaring it undeliverable, the letter that had broken his heart and started everything. The second was the first letter Margaret had successfully mailed, creased and worn from being read 1,000 times, tear-stained and precious beyond measure. "My friends," Klaus said to the assembled crowd, his English fluent now after 2 decades in America, "these letters represent 2 choices. The first letter represents the choice to follow rules even when those rules cause suffering. The second represents the choice to follow conscience even when conscience demands risk. Margaret Hayes chose conscience. She chose mercy. And that choice saved my mother's life and my own soul." He turned to Margaret, who stood quietly, uncomfortable with the attention, wishing this ceremony would end so she could return to her ranch and her normal life. "Mrs. Hayes," Klaus said, his voice thick with emotion, "you once told me that you did only what any mother would hope someone would do for her son. But that's not true. What you did required courage that most people do not have. It required seeing past everything that should have made us enemies and recognizing that we were, first and always, human beings who loved our families. You taught me that mercy is not weakness. It is the strongest force in the world." The audience applauded, and Margaret stepped forward to accept a plaque recognizing her contributions to post-war reconciliation. But when she spoke, her words were simple and sincere, stripped of any grandeur or self-congratulation. "The war made us enemies," she said quietly, "but a mother's tears made us human again. I did not do anything special. I simply remembered that every soldier is someone's son, and every mother deserves to know if her child is alive. If we can remember that, if we can hold on to that truth even when nations fight, then maybe we can prevent the next war, or at least limit the cruelty of the one we cannot prevent." Years later, those 2 letters, along with some of the correspondence between Margaret and the 15 families she had helped, were donated to a museum of Texas history. They sit now in a climate-controlled case, protected behind glass, artifacts of a time when the world was at war, but ordinary people found ways to preserve humanity in the cracks between battles. Visitors stop and read the letters, translated into English for those who do not speak German. They read about Klaus's desperation, about Helene's gratitude, about Margaret's quiet determination to do what she believed was right regardless of the cost. They read about mercy that defied regulations, about compassion that crossed enemy lines, about the simple truth that mothers everywhere speak the same language of love for their children. The museum placard tells the story simply. During World War II, when a German prisoner's letters home were rejected by authorities, a Texas rancher's wife secretly mailed them for 3 years, reuniting a mother and son across an ocean of war. Her actions remind us that humanity persists even in the darkest times, that individuals can choose mercy when systems demand coldness, that the bonds of family transcend the divisions of conflict. Margaret Hayes died in 1976 at the age of 79. Klaus Bergman spoke at her funeral, his daughter Margaret beside him, his grandchildren filling the pews. He told the story one more time, for all those gathered, about a young German prisoner desperate to reach his mother and an American woman brave enough to help him. "She saved more than my mother and me," he said. "She saved 15 families, hundreds of lives touched by her compassion. But more than that, she saved the idea that even in war there is room for kindness, that even when nations hate, individuals can love. That mercy is always possible, always necessary, always worth the risk." As the mourners filed past her casket, many saw what Klaus had placed there. A single envelope, old and yellowed, addressed in careful handwriting to Frau Helene Bergmann, Schillerstrasse 17, Stuttgart, Germany. The letter that had started everything, the letter that had been rejected and then reborn through Margaret's courage. It rested on her chest, over her heart where it belonged, and somewhere, in that mystery beyond death, perhaps 2 mothers sat together finally, Helene Bergman and Margaret Hayes, sharing stories about their sons, about the war that had tried to make them enemies, about the love that had made them sisters instead. Because in the end, that was the truth that outlasted all the battles and regulations and divisions. Love transcends war. Mercy defeats hatred, and a mother's tears, whether German or American, speak a language that all humans understand, if only we have the courage to listen.